Welcome to those of you who have arrived today. Our panel today is called The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, and we're going to be looking at a lot of different aspects of the future of feature documentary with a very eminent panel, which we're very lucky to have. There's not much business to take care of. We'll be doing a group chat for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions for a good 20 minutes at the end. If anybody does have anything absolutely pressing that they'd like to interject at any point, we do have a roving mic, so please catch my eye or the eye of one of the team here, and we'll try and get a question to you. My name's Rajesh Thind. I'm a filmmaker, and on my left is Mandy Chang, the new editor of BBC's premier prestige international documentary brand, the Storyville slot, which is 20 years old, and I think the new run begins tonight.
Tonight,
the new Storyville slot.
Quite late because it's an edgy film, but it's Mathew Heinemann's City of Ghosts, which is fantastic. You're all here, so you probably won't get to see it, but you can watch it on iPlayer, and we've got a run of 6 going out over the next 6 weeks. Great, brilliant. Mm-hmm. And Mandy's I've known Mandy for many years. Mandy's a very experienced producer director in her own right, BAFTA award-winning, Peabody's, international Emmys. I've been doing my homework. I was very impressed myself. And for the last several years, has been working at ABC in Australia as head of arts commissioning there. And to our left there, we have Lisa Marie Russo, the incoming head of the new BFI's Doc Society Film Fund, which I'm sure we've all got lots of questions about. Lisa Marie is also a very experienced producer.
Ask away.
With a very wide range of experience with some very interesting films, which I suggest you all sort of have a look at. We're all going to be sort of seeing some clips which give us a flavour for each of the panellists' tastes as well. To her left, we have Elhum Shakerifar of Hawakati Films, a very dynamic and busy producer who produced the opening night film for the festival in Northern Seoul, as well as Sean McAllister's previous film, Syria, A Love Story, and also a film, Even When I Fall, which we're going to see a clip of. And I'd say Elhum was one of the most interesting producers in the market, and one of the most progressive, and one of the most hardworking.
Well, thank you.
And over in the end there, we have Kim Christensen, who's head of documentaries for DR Sales. Kim's a veteran sales agent. There's nothing about the market that he doesn't know, and nobody he hasn't had a drink with. So I'm going to start with you, Lisa Marie, because the new fund has taken its first applications. You're going to be announcing the first round of awards in July. I'm sure everybody's totally up to speed and everyone's read all the application forms and anything, but
You'd be the first audience ever.
Could I ask you to just set out the stall?
Yeah.
What's the approach? How much money have you got? What kind of films are you going to be sort of, looking for and speak to you? And any point you want, tell us and we'll show your clips as well.
Okay, so the fund, we are creativity and diversity. I think they're 2 buzzwords for us. The fund is for creative documentaries, and that can be anything from hybrid, personal, archive, essay films, or film with just, you have unique access to a really great character. I'd love to see some funny things. We were talking about that earlier. And the company is also very committed to projects about climate change. That's just something, company-wide we're interested in, so I want to float that out there. We have £650,000 to spend a year. We hope that will go up next year. That also includes money for shorts, and we'll announce a short scheme later in the summer, but it will probably be something like 10 films around the 11,000 K mark, and that'll be a scheme, so they should be all finished within a year. What else can I tell you?
Well, maybe I can jump straight in with a bit of a toughie. So, I was looking at the figures for the BFI's spend on documentary over the last 3 years, and it averaged out, it was about 980 one year, 1.4 another year, 1.2 the next, averaged out about 1.2 million a year. You've got half of that.
Yeah. So the BFI decided to put the documentary, overall management of the documentary out to tender a few years ago. Doc Society was awarded that tender, And that was because they wanted to bring in people that had expertise and could commit time and energy to an overall strategy that included education and working with people in the regions and helping people with sales agent relationships, distributor relationships. And Doc Society also runs something called Good Pitch, which I encourage you to look at on the website and read a bit about. It's an international program that pairs up producers with potential funders, and that could be people from NGOs, charities, really outside the traditional funding world. So those are the skill set that we aim to bring to it. Why there is less money? The BFIs had cuts and they made cuts. So that, that's really a question to kind of put to them. We're working with what the tender asked to be put out there, and also using those resources to go to the regions. We had a great day-long session in Newcastle on the 30th where we brought up commissioners from Vice, Nowness, The Guardian, Random Acts. And this is really about bringing people to the community. We're going to do 4 of these events this year. One includes this trip to Sheffield. And we also did many case studies with Sam Haley's Island of Hungry Ghosts and Ian Cunningham's film Irene's Ghost, which will come out later in the year. And these were BFI creative documentaries that I felt were really good examples of the kind of things they did. I showed a bit of A Deal with the Universe, which we'll see a clip of from later. So that is really, and we did one-to-ones, and that's something we want to continue to do, to be meeting people on their own turf. And we're also going to have an edit lab, which we're looking for partners to work on with that. It'll be outside of London. And it's really about bringing the editors and directors together, feature doc people, and getting away from the heat in the cutting room and letting them have an opportunity to learn from mentors and peers and really work on their projects in a dedicated space.
I think that's so important. I think as feature docs become so much more prominent, the emphasis on craft can't be enough, can it?
Yeah, and I think we've identified there's not enough feature doc editors, so if people are thinking where they might fit into the industry, I think it's really worth considering, because it's a role that is integral to the storytelling, and we want to help people craft that. And I've noticed separately, I worked on, prior to this position, I was an exec on this initiative called Random Acts Ignition Network for young people 16 to 24. So my company exec'd 72 films over 3 years by young people from the Southeast. And this happened all over the country. There were 5 centers doing this. And you just realize that younger people need to get really start to learn that editing is not just button pushing. And maybe this has come across with digital much harder in the days of film, when you're actually cutting something, to just do it in chronological order and assume that the way the script is the way that the film is going to end up. Learning how to use those pieces of the puzzle and supporting the director in telling that story.
And in terms of because there's $650, I know, for the pot for the film financing, then there's another $350 for training and outreach. Yeah. And I know you've had a road show in Newcastle. Yeah. Could you tell us about your regional activity?
Well, that is the main, there'll be 2 more road shows. There'll be 4 a year, and the edit lab that come out of that activity. We're also just talking a little bit behind the scenes with other partners about other initiatives we might be able to launch that we just don't know yet. But just to clear the air, if you haven't seen it, there was a Screen Daily article that was about producers who felt aggrieved that the money had gone down, which I
think the specific point, which was of query, was the cap or upper limit of 80,000, which had been mentioned. Could you address that?
Yes, because I told the journalist it wasn't a cap, but he then used the word ceiling. I wish I'd said it's not a ceiling.
But there is a maximum amount. There's £650,000. So it's going to be divided up among how many films?
We want to spread the love, and probably would be about 12 films. I mean, because we can come in at any point: development, production, distribution. You can come back to us at a later stage in your journey. We also don't take rights in the films, which is
This is a big change. You're not taking any equity as opposed to the old BFI model.
No, there's an equity. The BFI equity model still exists with the producer's corridor and the lockbox, and that repayment goes back to the BFI. It doesn't go to Doc Society. But we don't take a share in the copyright, which is what the BFI did. And we're also going to launch a consultation later in the year that looks at grants funding versus equity-based funding, because the model in many places around the world, in lots of parts of Europe and America, is that money for documentaries is grants-based.
But just to play devil's advocate,
Yeah.
I mean, you can forget about the language of cap or upper limit, but if we've got 650 and you want to make 12 films, that's about 80 grand a film.
Well, and that's for the production ones. That, a development grant would be much smaller than that, and it might not be 80 grand just because it's a production one. We have to take a look at it's a competition. 145 entries came in. It's really tough.
Yeah.
So we have to look at the slate overall, and we are very committed to diversity in all of its forms. So that be gender, sexuality, BAME, class, working in the regions, super serious about that. We did that with those random act shorts. And we had very high diversity numbers, and we felt that the reason for that was people weren't told no. So they hadn't started their careers, already been beaten down. So
still taking the beatings, even now, 20 years on.
So the commitments to that, I don't, it would seem kind of perverse to be able to put 200,000 into one film. That we just can't do it.
Maybe now's a good moment to have it, because obviously this raises the question of taste and types of films and what you're going to be looking for. This question you mentioned about climate change, and obviously one of the other concerns the article that you mentioned raised was the question of what will be the types of films that are made. Are we going to be looking at films that aim to do good, or are we looking for films that aim to do well and are good?
Yeah. Well, we can't fund journalistic films. The Doc Society runs another international journalism fund called the Birth of Journalism Fund. And so the idea of our fund is not to do campaigning films, basically, and not what people might describe as social impact, but we do want the films to have impact. Doc Society coined the term impact producer, who was someone that would work alongside a producer or maybe do and you can speak about this a little bit maybe, but the producer might do that, but it's really about audience building. So we will do that as well. I mean, every film needs an audience, and we need to be thinking about that ahead of time. The other thing is we don't, you don't have to have a sales agent and distributor attached, which I think is a new thing. It's really hard. So.
But the model, in terms of 80,000 is not going to finance most films entirely. So the model itself actually changes the expectations on filmmakers. I'm wondering whether the fact that filmmakers are now more likely to have to put together various pots of money.
BFI has never singly funded a film anyway, except they do have a low budget fiction.
But Notes on Blindness, but in the last few years, Notes on Blindness got 293,000, 20,000 Days on Earth got 214,000, Who's Gonna Love Me Now got 269, etc., etc. You guys got, what is it? 200
Yeah, I mean, if I can just jump in maybe.
Please,
I think I'm really curious to see what the new round will bring. I think there are lots of things that are actually being simplified in terms of the relationship with the BFI through this new iteration of funds.
Just that you've had BFI funding on 2 of your projects, is that right? Or 3?
3.
3, right.
On
so
3
you know this
projects.
territory. Yeah.
And the BFI has always operated with, trying to find the right way to work with documentaries, perhaps operated with a more fiction-like approach, which involved closing the film, as in closing the finances, having all the finances in before releasing any financing, which isn't easy for a verite-type documentary.
Or for new filmmakers.
Or for new filmmakers. There were all sorts of different things, like the level of legal budget you needed to have, the different types of deliverables that you needed, the ongoing paperwork. I mean, all of these things I understand were necessary, but these are all things I understand are being simplified. And
done very well, as I've said to you.
Things like not needing a sales agent at that point of closing that deal is really important, because that's something that isn't always clear for a documentary, particularly at the beginning, or if, a funder's coming in early stages of production. So, to me, this is what it is, and maybe we should just see what the first round looks like, and actually perhaps it's a call to British documentarians to make better films rather than kind of films that do good or do well. I think, strong storytelling should be the aim, and that would hopefully do both.
Absolutely.
And perhaps in the long run, it's, I can speak really about documentary in this country, and I feel like we need some sort of PR job to not look like the younger sibling to the great fiction film. And that will be the difference in getting more money, I think, ultimately.
Could I just check, is anybody from the BFI here? No, I did speak to them the other day. I spoke to Ben Luxford, who's head of audiences, and sort of flagged that these issues might come up. And and he said I could quote him. Because is quite right, this is a question for the BFI. In the end, it's about, is there enough money for documentary, and is the BFI fully committed to it, and is this reduction in funding something we should be alarmed about, and he said, one big reason for putting the doc fund out was because we were always worried we weren't giving the documentaries the attention they deserve. He also said, putting the fund out has always been intended to put greater focus on docs than we could in the current film fund setup. Early days, so bound to be some skepticism, but it's a sincere act by us. And they've increased their funding. They also, BFI also invest in the festival. So I think it's sort of jury's out. But
can I just say something?
Yeah.
I think that's the reason why so many British directors seek money in America, because there's so much more money in it now. It's not just Netflix. It's also, CNN, A&E, HBO, Showtime. They're all putting money in, and vastly greater amounts of money than we have.
But this is public money, and in the States there's very little public money. There is that difference.
There is public money though as well.
Pots, which are the big pots?
IDA, ITVS.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very healthy there at the moment. And, I don't want us to lose our directors, because we have very, very good talent here to the States. And nor do I want us making only films in the States about American stories. Storyville needs a diversity of stories. And, just bringing in Kim, the Danish completely punch above their weight, because they really support their filmmakers, and they have funds, and they support documentaries in lots of different ways, and that's why we like working with them, and we like working with Danish directors. Is that right?
Thank you.
But that's something you very assiduously sort of developed, I know.
Well, our producers are really moaning as well, but just going through the numbers here, I think the Danish Film Institute put out at least double the amount of what I'm hearing here. It's on various programs, because it also involves children and youth and a talent program. But the thing is, we're 5 million people in Denmark. You can do your own math in terms of how much we put extra into films, and if you go to Norway, it's even more, and so on and so on. So,
and this is happening in a context. I mean, I know in this country there's a sort of, there's a degree of risk aversion, for example, among theatrical distribution, just because the numbers are getting soft and people are staying home and watching Netflix. And is that something you're facing in Denmark as well, or?
Sure. I mean, people don't go and watch documentaries in the cinemas in Denmark for some weird reason, except from when we have the festivals. So there's some other points that you are aiming for when you do the film through this program, but it's kind of bizarre actually, because on one hand, because this is the government giving out this money, and on the other hand, they are trying to they are doing a cut down on 20% on DR and removing those money that we should put in together with the film institutes, and it's so I mean that's never a true right.
I'm going to stop just there. I think we'll go to a first clip. What do you think, Marie? Would you like to set up these two clips? We've got two short clips from Lisa Marie.
One is a little scene from A Deal with the Universe, which is Jason Barker's film, which is a trans story about a man having a baby, and I just think it's super inspirational. And it was something he documented in his own life for over 8 years, and I really like these films. I don't think we have enough of them that have material that covers a very large span of time. And very kind of handmade quality, but the storytelling in it is very strong, and it's a super unique story. I never saw a film about a man having a baby before. Very uplifting. The other one is a trailer for a film I made with Andrew Cotting and Ian Sinclair called Swan Down, where they took a swan pedalo from Hastings to Hackney during the right before the Olympics, and BritDoc, which is the name of Doc Society, the prior name, was happened to be one of the funders of that. But they're two water-based things, so I liked showing the water together. But also, I just thought the Swan Down one was kind of fun because when you make a low-budget documentary, all of a sudden you get to the end of the process and people are like, where's your trailer? Where's your poster? And you're like, uh-oh, there's no money for that. And of course, it's a lot easier to do these things now. But we didn't have a trailer. We didn't have anybody left to cut the trailer. So we thought, oh, we'll just take a tiny snippet of the film. And so it was like a little surprise that popped up in the theater and didn't give too much away.
Great. Let's go to the first two clips, please, James. Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks. And just to say that Jason's film will be out in the autumn. Peccadillo Pictures is putting it out, so I urge you to go see it.
And those suggest to me that the range of films that you're sort of interested in is very wide indeed.
Yeah, they're two very, there's space for the quirky, is what I would say.
Great, brilliant. Okay, so we're going to come to you, Mandy. Mm-hmm. New broom at Storyville. How long have you been in the job now?
I'm not sweeping everything away.
No, are you not? That's what the question was going to be. How are we looking at continuity?
Since October.
Since October.
Yeah.
And how many have you commissioned many films since then? Have you finished any?
I've started commissioning. I mean, there was not a backlog because we kind of took over, and it's really funny because when I commission a film, I know I'm not going to see it until at least another year or more, sometimes 3 years, 2 years. Yeah. So it's a really long-term relationship that we have with people. And that's, that's really important for us, I think, at Storyville. We want people to come to us direct. We'd rather not. I mean, there's the acquisitions, there's the pre-buys, and but when we get to the co-pros and the kind of the things that we're more directly involved in, we do want to have that relationship, and we want to be editorially involved from the start of the film.
And let's ask, because I know that's very much a BBC approach. I mean, there's very much, I think you're also one of the only major slots that, if you buy a film, seek to have editing rights. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of pushback on that.
I'm sure there is.
Because we haven't got a lot of money, and a lot of producers and exec producers say, well, why should you have any editorial say because you're only putting in X amount of money? And I think it's the wrong approach because there's a value to the editorial that we bring to a film, and we want to help enhance and make that film better, and to give the support to the directors, and to make that film the best film that it can be. And there's a lot of those films in America now, and we noticed it at Sundance when we went there, that I just felt like they hadn't been properly executive produced.
Not enough rigor.
Not enough rigor, too long.
There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of new EPs in the marketplace.
There are a lot of new EPs in the marketplace, and they're not just coming from that traditional background of having been filmmakers or, having been in the business for a long time. They're coming from, some of them are philanthropists who are putting large amounts of money into the film and then putting their name on it. If we take philanthropy money, they cannot be editorially involved.
So what about numbers? Let's have some hard numbers. How much cash have you got, and how much are you going to give
so
to us?
We haven't got much more than $1 million, but what we do is which is tiny, but we make that go a long way. We commission about between 20 and 24 films, and there's kind of 4 modes. One is straight acquisition, one is pre-buy, one is co-pro, which is probably what we do the most of, and then there are some films that we put a substantially larger amount of money into. But that's only, if you've got $1 million, it can only be about $100,000. And, the scale is...
That's your top end then, about $100,000?
That's the top end, yeah.
And in terms of, are you still maintaining the international outlook? Is it going to become, is it sort of...
Yeah, it's a global strand.
Good.
And it's open to everyone. But, having said that, we get I don't know how many do we get, Hayley? Over 1,000 proposals every year, thousands.
And you're a small team.
And the percentage that we actually commission is tiny. So it's really, that's a huge part of the job, just sifting through and balancing the slate up and saying what do we want and what are the important stories of our times and how do we make sense of the world we live in and what are the best films to express that. And within that, the huge range of that, the diversity. And for me, diversity is really important, you know. And I get a lot of domestic stories from this country, but unless it's got international cut through, it's not going to work because we have to raise the funding from all over the place. And so having those relationships with other public service broadcasters in America, in Europe, and, you know, a whole other multitude of funders, whether it's philanthropists, not-for-profit, you know, that's really important to us. And we have to, we're patchwork funding. We're not, like the rest of the BBC, fully funded.
So can I just check in the room, how many people in the room are producers, directors making a feature film? Could you put your hands up if you are? Okay, quite a significant proportion. So what would be your advice to people who are coming to you in terms of how to get the project ready, which stage to come to you at, in terms of making sure that the quality's there, that it's hitting the mark? What's your sort of top tips?
Well, I think it's not to put too much work into it, to test the idea out with us first, because there might be, you know, with something that's very kind of prescient or in the ether or zeitgeisty, there might be 3 or 4 ideas out there, and it really will be about which is the best idea and which is the best filmmaker to make it. I mean, there's a Storyville website, and it's got really good advice on it of how to put ideas in, and we're about to launch a new kind of electronic pitching platform that we really want people to kind of submit their ideas through that so that we can really keep track of everything, because it's really difficult to keep on top of things. And, you know, we're always getting producers complaining and saying, you haven't come back to me, and, you know, it's been X number of weeks, and, you know, but if they saw the mountain of stuff that we have to get through, and we try and respond to people quickly, but that's not always possible. And sometimes we have to track things because the story's undeveloped, and we need to see where it's going, and we need to see how it's evolving before we can put the money down, because the money is really precious. And
what about in terms of, because I know we had a chat in terms of types of films, because I know Storyville, you know, traditionally has been a sort of you know, a great place for traditional, great, ob-dark actuality, you know, films. And I know you're very interested in that. I know you've made films like that.
And
but I also know you're interested in innovation as well.
Yeah, and still is, because, you know, Nick and Kate left an amazing legacy, and I want to hold on to that. And, you know, Nick was into a lot of geopolitical... but, you know, the Storyville slate's always been incredibly diverse, and diversity is really important. You know, I'm interested in that kind of lighter touch storytelling, but that still deals with very resonant subject matter. History is really, you know, as long as it's resonant with the now, is important. And but I'm really interested in films that push the form. So I'm kind of, and I don't see enough of those proposals, you know. And when I think of, you know, something like Notes on Blindness, you know, I love that film, and I love the fact that it's taking a subject that all of us can relate to, or can relate to the idea of going blind, and really pushing out the boundaries of how to conceptualize that idea. And I mean, I think you're the same, Lisa Marie, that you're looking for those kinds of stories as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a woman called Marilyn Milgram who's a script editor. She works in-house at the BFI, but she also works freelance. And she worked on Notes on Blindness. She may have done a bit on A Deal with the Universe. And she worked on Irene's Ghost. And I think it's interesting for hybrid films. Sometimes you may want to have a character like that who is a story editor and someone that really deals with the script side of the filmmaking and helping to shape the narration.
I think it's really, I mean, because filmmakers are so caught up in getting the access, you know, raising the budget, and thinking about all the things you have to think about when you make a film. But to think more laterally, and because the sky's the limit with a feature doc.
Increasingly so, perhaps.
Yes. And, you know, there's so many feature docs on the market. Just look at all the films showing here, and there's a festival. I could go to a festival. I could just not be in the office ever and go to a festival every week. But the thing is, it's how do you make your film stand out in this environment and this climate? What is going to, the power of storytelling is not just about observational films. And observational films are fantastic, and when you have great access and there's an unfolding drama going on, there's nothing better. But I think there are many different other types of films, and I would like to see more of those kinds of films on the Storyville slate.
And I think I think you really need to be watching films and not just on Netflix or where it's the easiest place to watch it. If you are part of the British filmmaking community, then you really should know the work of people like Sean McAllister and Andrew Cotting and Jason and many people, Clio Barnard and Carol Morley, and know these films inside and out and be able to relate to them and discuss them in some way and see where your film fits into a world of projects. I think that's been a little bit of a shocking thing for me coming into the role, that people don't always know what's going on in the British scene. And just to go back to the American subject matter, there are a lot of British filmmakers telling stories in America. And for our fund, you need to pass the cultural test, which you can read about on the website. It's not an impossibility. But in the main, we want to be telling UK stories or things that really resonate with the UK. And I think we do have questions about why people go into America so much. Now, you might say it's the money, but then again, these are people that are looking to piece together things, so it's not necessarily that they're doing fully funded films for broadcast entities, but I would just like to encourage people to be looking,
Well, it's not just the money. It's because there have been fantastic American feature docs made that the filmmakers here are really inspired by, and it's such a rich vein of storytelling, America, because it's kind of supersized.
I'm going to come to you, Elhum, straight. I'm going to come to you for that. Just before we do, I'd just like to maybe good time for a clip, which gives an example, which speaks to a lot of this stuff immediately. So, would you like to set up the clip?
So this is a film that we've taken for Storyville, and it's called The Raft. And it's what I find really interesting about it. It's made by a theatre director. So he brings this kind of really interesting sensibility to it. And it's the story of one of these crazy academics who, from the 50s and 60s, who has this theory that people always resort to violence. So he comes up with this experiment, and he builds building a raft, putting ads in papers, gathering a crew of, might I say, quite good-looking young people, and who have no experience of sailing, with one Swedish skipper who does know how to sail. And it's like Noah's Ark on top of a boat. But so there's all this archival footage of that, but then he builds a raft inside a studio, because he's a theatre director, and he brings the survivors back to this raft. They've never seen it, so it's their reactions, but it's them looking back, and it cuts between this experience of then and now, and you'll see.
It's fascinating.
It's fabulous.
Let's have the clip of the raft, please, James.
That looks great.
Thank you. That's great. Elhum, to come to you to pick up on these questions.
Well, I suppose I just wanted to talk about the idea of risk, because so to me, making films is often about taking a risk, jumping in with an idea, trying to work something out. And it takes a long time to do that. And there are very few people who'll jump in with you at the beginning. And particularly, there are very few people who'll jump in with a first-time director, and anyone who hasn't supposedly proven themselves, or who doesn't navigate the space or of the industry in as good a way as some of the kind of the more established directors, so I think that's one of the reasons why people look to the US. There's a lot of foundation funding. There's a lot more openness, in a sense. You can go with a kind of a kernel of an idea, and people will trust you to develop it a little bit. And we'll trust first-time directors maybe, or directors who don't have any particular experience but have something to say, or they feel there's something to say, I think.
Could you just tell us which of the American funds that do you have to direct experience of working with?
Well, there are things like Catapult, for example, or Sundance has a development fund. I mean, I say this, and at the same time, you need to have developed a film to a certain point to actually go to anyone. So this is something that I think we really need to think about within the landscape of documentary, particularly in the UK. If we do want any more diverse voices, then we need to actually support them. And these will be people who've never made a film before because they can't afford to, because you can't afford to spend a whole year developing an idea or, you know, exploring something, particularly in another country, particularly when it's complex. And if we really want to hear from those voices, then we need to find ways to support them on their own terms, in their own voices. And I produce mainly first-time directors, apart from Sean. But in an interesting way, you know, the work that I do with Sean also challenges a mainstream, but he's a much more established director, so many doors open for him automatically, and that's understandable. What I do is I see those doors open and I take something else into that space, and perhaps it will give, you know, will have a little bit more of people's attention for that reason, and then it can flourish in its own right. But, you know, the budgets are entirely different. They are piecemeal budgets. They're pieced together with lots and lots and lots of different sources of funding. Often they involve directors taking a real risk themselves. Even When I Fall, which is the clip that I'll show, is by two first-time female directors. They both had babies in the process of the film's making. They made, you know, I think they worked on the film for about 3 years before any major funding came in. And that involved working all hours, you know, taking the salaries that they were getting from other things into these one-off shoots in Nepal, making small pots of money last for a very long time. And my concern with that approach is that you can do that once. You can't do that again and again. You can't create a career in that way. And particularly if by being a first-time director, you're having to prove yourself constantly, rather than being trusted because perhaps you're saying something different that might be valuable to listen to. So the idea of risk is something that I find very interesting. I think, you know, we need to think about who's taking risks and how, and who can afford to take risks, and what can we do to support the people who can't afford to take risks, but who should, because that's when new voices come about. That's what the US have been doing a lot better, I think.
I agree with you.
With foundation funding.
There's not enough support for that level of new people coming into the industry, and there are lots of people coming into the industry because feature docs are a really popular form. And it's not just feature docs, like a lot of directors kind of make their way by starting with a small film, you know, and building on their experience. And it's about being able to make mistakes. It's about getting some seed funding. And Sean's career started on the BBC. He was given there was this fabulous strand of where young people were given cameras and told to go out and make a film. And that was a risk taken on a working class man who had a story to tell. And, you know, he has gone on to build on that voice, and he's been supported by the BBC. But I still think there aren't enough spaces in the British media. And, you know, it's great what you're doing with the lab, and I would love to do a lab on Storyville, because we take on a lot of, not a lot, because we can't take on loads, but first-time filmmakers, because they come with brilliant stories and they come with the access to those stories, and we want to support them, but we can't support lots and lots of those people because it's very time-consuming. And we might match them up with a really great exec producer. But I think all the mediums in British broadcasting and other areas that support filmmaking need to think about this, and need to think about how we can support at the grassroots. Well, sometimes support isn't necessarily bringing in other expertise. Sometimes it's time, and time is so precious in that development space. Sometimes it's time to be able to just think or make sense of what it is you're trying to do.
And particularly in spaces where we're talking about diversity, these are voices that have been basically crushed by mainstream narratives. There's no space on, whether anywhere for those voices. And so when you're it's like you're gathering your courage and the ways that you're going to tell a specific story in the face of all the things that are oppressing you. You need some time, and you need time to trust in your own voice, in your own words, and with a real sense of agency. And I don't have an answer, but I really think that's where...
Yeah. Well, I thought I've read something you've written about Even When I Fall, which we've got a clip of, which I thought was fascinating, because you point out that it's not just in the way that the film was made and the way it was financed, but also the actual narrative mode, the fact that you've got strong women characters, and the fact that we're used to seeing women in films as victims or as somehow disempowered, and actually your characters are very empowered. And that, to me, is very much a part of diversity. I mean, that sort of, those narrative changes and those sort of really looking at the form and the unspoken assumptions that we're so sort of blind to in film. I mean, I'm always amazed. Every film I produce, I'm kind of amazed by the landscape that responds to it. With Even When I Fall, I think I was amazed to see that strong women don't actually sell. I think we tell ourselves this story, but we sell stories of victimhood around particularly the idea of trafficking, and that's one of the core themes of this film. It tells the story of the first circus in Nepal, which was set up by a group of women who are survivors of trafficking circuses in India. And it's a story of how they reframe the narrative of victimhood. And throughout the course of that film's, as we tried to fund that film, it seemed to be an impossible to understand reality, because the idea of being in a bad circus and a good circus was too confusing. But with the finished film, it was surprising to me that it didn't attract that, it seemed to be too risky. I was told constantly that it was too complex, too risky, which I've essentially boiled down to mean this is not a trafficking story about victims, it's a trafficking story about survivors. And what was interesting is that, for me as a producer, I had to ensure that the film retains a sense of value, really, in the industry, to make sure that those directors continue and make a next film. And so I distributed the film, and cinemas and exhibitors across the country didn't have the same issues. They're very close to people, and they saw immediately that it's something that would resonate, and it's had a very successful run, which has kind of kick-started its commercial life, let's say. I love how low-key you are about it. I distributed the film. I mean, that's an enormous amount of work.
Yeah, but it's because actually I think as a producer we have to take these steps as well. If there's no one who's going to do it for you, then it's not good enough to just have made a film anymore. You need to make sure that film is seen on a mainstream stage. Right. And it's part of my responsibility to ensure that it is. I'm not happy about having distributed the film. I'm actually quite upset that nobody else saw the value of it. Yeah. And that we've been validated by the critical response, by audience response, by how well it's done. It will be on all the VOD channels. It's having a DVD release. Yeah. It's doing all of the things that it's...
So to address, in a second we'll address this question of whether sales agents are deeply out of touch with the market with Kim. But before that, we'll let's see your clip.
Sure.
Could we go to the Even When I Fall clip? Kim, I think the questions that have come up, and it seems there is a sort of risk aversion at the sort of distribution sales end of the process. I mean, I think these days very much the last part of, as difficult it is to raise the money, have a good idea, make the film, get it produced, the hardest bit is getting it out there. Can you sort of speak to us about how you see things?
It's really wide now, but of course the market has expanded, so there are more opportunities. And you hear all these crazy stories about Netflix and Amazon and a lot of people coming into the market, and they're also disappearing quite fast again, and so on and so on. So for us particularly, we have just been good friends with the TV industry all through this period, and which was the easiest way to get our films funded on the international market. it's very, very difficult to understand what these larger corporations wants and does and these kind of things. So we have been sort of like back to basic all along, and for some reason it's also because I come out of the TV environment, so that's a natural place to sort of like.
But I spoke to Morgan Matthews this week as part of the research for and Morgan made a very interesting distinction between broadcast features and feature documentary, and how they're very distinct. So do you find that as well?
Sure. No, yeah, definitely. But all the films that we engage in are, of course, broadcast features, you would say. Very few of them they're picked up on acquisition occasionally for smaller channels, but in terms of what I am engaged in international scene, it's all something that has to be commercial, definitely. Otherwise, we couldn't do it. I mean,
and most of the features we do have a limited theatrical release and do the festival circuit, so we have to wait a long time for them sometimes.
Yeah, but that's another thing that I'm working on, shorting these windows, and I could say we are always looking for the perfect match between the festival and the TV kind of film. That comes very rare, but like say Last Man in Aleppo that BBC acquired is a very good example. And what I did was to ensure that people who entered the film with production money, that we would have a very short window, because the whole thing in Syria and all these kind of things were extremely important to go out. So after premiering at Sundance in late January, we had it on cinema in New York and Los Angeles just a few months after, and then it could actually go straight to TV. And at the same time do all the festivals around the world. And it's doable. People think that it's not, but it actually is. And because once you had the premiere at the A Festival, sort of like the virginity is gone, and then you just deal with all these territories where you can get the most out of it. But it takes some, of course, but yeah.
But you'd advise producers to start having those conversations early, looking to innovate in terms of sort of the lengths of windows? Are those conversations you encourage people to have?
Sure, but I mean, I always encourage people to do the best possible film, and that would sort of like do the trick. You cannot do the math in terms of length or this and that, and then if you put your heart and your soul in it and do the best possible film, it's probably
sorry, just shortening windows is great, but it does also depend on everyone who's involved in that film agreeing. So for A Syrian Love Story in the UK, we had a 10-day theatrical window, but that involved a meeting of 20 people around the table from the BFI, the BBC, and all of the different creative teams involved to agree this. And it was fantastic for the film, but it took a really long time for everyone to be confident that that would be the best thing for it. And so I think teams can aspire and suggest, but actually they need everyone else to follow through as well.
There needs to be some change.
You know, you can't.
Can I ask?
Sorry.
I just want to ask one more question. So in terms of just to talk to this point about commerciality, what we've also seen a big rise, and I'd like to get your opinion on this. I mean, I've got a quote here from Lucy Walker, the director, who said, with the rise of the docuseries, this was in Screen, with the rise of the docuseries, the challenge is to keep the content as rich and riveting as for shorter or single pieces. I hate diluted, bloated, overlong work like everyone else. Can I speak to you about that pressure to make docuseries and whether you think those are necessarily, they've yet quite reached their sort of creative peak in terms of sort of people getting their real grip?
You should have a very good reason for doing it. I mean, you just look at in the fiction, there are more and more drama series out there. Are there any good reasons for putting all these long? I think not. I think I'm actually personally going back to the feature film, because these series are overlong and too many. And you know, like I think yes, there's a good reason for have docuseries, but it should not be just because that's what's happening in the market.
Well, you need the content needs to you know, be able to carry that. In fiction, you're making it up, so you can do that easily. But I had a question for for Kim.
And then we'll open
Mandy.
it up for
Yeah.
questions.
So anyway, I'd heard a worrying story about a sales agent who took a film and on the expectation that Netflix was going to buy it, but did not kind of share this with the filmmakers as the reason they were coming on board. And then Netflix didn't take it, and now they're saying, well, maybe someone else should be selling this. Now that's been a big waste of their time. And in addition to that, I know, there's a thing with filmmakers thinking like Netflix might solve all their problems. But we've talked about things within the company of trying to get, finding a way to encourage the public broadcasters internationally to band together, to be trying to make kind of group counter bids, or so that, because I suppose the thing is that Netflix can react quite quickly. And
We're already doing that.
yeah, so it'd be great if you, because I've only heard it anecdotally, but if you could maybe tell us a bit more about that, it'd be interesting for the audience.
So we did that with the Fourth Estate, which is the first year of Trump's presidency, through the eyes of the journalists of the New York Times, and that's that came out of this idea of, there was a Sundance where what was it, the one that won the Oscar,
Icarus?
Icarus. And and Netflix was pouncing on everything at Sundance, and so we all went this year, and we had formed this coalition of, through a sales agent, Annie Roney at Rocco from Rocco Films, and she pretty much gathered together all the European broadcasters, including the BBC, because we're still European at the moment. And we all put money towards being involved in the Fourth Estate, Liz Garbus's film, which is going out on the 24th of June on Sunday at 9 o'clock. And it's a brilliant, brilliant series. And Showtime put in, I think it was $3 million, and we couldn't have come anywhere near that. But the generosity of the people involved, and the kind of Annie's hard work in kind of bringing us all together, taking that to the table. And that's something we've continued, and we did this at Sundance as well, where we all clubbed together to buy a film.
I should say we did invite Netflix to be in the panel.
And in another perspective, it is like this, that all the films I'm involved in, it has broadcast money attached to it. So Netflix cannot overtake this film. So the few films that Netflix acquired afterwards, and not commissioned as an original, because there's a big difference. They took the territories available, and there was nothing about that. And with The Last Man in Aleppo, it was a share between the PBS and Netflix in America, and it was all fine.
But it's not about the money. I think it's about the spirit of the thing. It's about people wanting their film to go out on a public service platform, wanting it to be seen, wanting it to have impact in the press, and not just being another, 6-part series on Netflix.
No, but for me it was the perfect, I'm all for democratization of documentaries, and going out on public TV and then being available to be screened at Netflix. It's a perfect match for me.
But I mean, Netflix have got all the old Storyvilles.
I'm going to stop you there, because we're going to watch Kim's clip, which is a great lineup for the World Cup that starts later this week, and then we're going to go to questions. So please have a think about your questions during this clip. Can we go to the final clip, please, Chang?
Wow.
Okay, good. Let's go to questions. We've got a mic there. There's a gentleman opening the bidding there. There we go. Could you tell us your name, please, and what you do as well?
Sure. This is Murray Coulter of Stern and Wild. The environment for feature documentaries is very fluid. I mean, you look at the last 5 years. 5 years ago, if someone had said it's the American studios that are making a big impact and American filmmakers that are inspiring everybody else, that would have meant very little to any of us. Things are moving fast, and we've talked a lot about the present of feature documentaries. But this is a brilliant panel. We've got great opinions. I'd love to know what they see in their crystal balls for the future of feature docs.
Quite right. Good question. Who'd like to pick up on that? Come on,
Well, it's
crystal ball
changing.
gazing.
It's changing. I mean, look at how Netflix has changed over the past, couple of years. They've gone from having feature docs, and now they're really big on these 6-part series. They're doing 12-part series now. Who knows what will happen? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. They could. I mean, it seems like it's being primed up for them to sell to a higher bidder, and that could change the game again. It's a really fluid situation. I mean, Vice is changing. The thing that people like Rupert Murdoch bought into with Vice is now becoming something different. So all that edgy stuff with I can't remember the name of it. The gay presenters going to kind of hotspots around the world and looking at homophobia and issues like this. They've now got Paris Hilton, and they've just elbowed those Ellen and I can't remember the Ian out. So
Do you think there's a possibility for consolidation? I mean, I looked at the share prices and I saw Netflix is now more valuable than Disney as of about a week ago. So there is a new era. I mean, so do you see consolidation ahead and narrowing? Are we in a golden time now, but it might get worse?
I don't know. But the thing is, all we can do is do the best to support the industry, to commission really good films, and to bring on new talent, and to bring on different voices as well. Storyville's the only game in town. It's such a shame that
there has been a retreat from
that is the only
documentary
global
broadcast,
platform, and it's and that's why it's more important than ever to band with other like-minded, broadcasters around the world, and to continue to support. I want to support the British industry, but also I'm interested in all those voices because we are a global brand from around the world, and new voices from all of those kind of, especially third world countries like Africa or India, where really interesting filmmakers are emerging in those spaces.
Elhum, you're in the trenches with this. How do you see things shaping up? Is broadcast now sort of, apart from Storyville, off your radar?
I was going to say, speaking to the title of this panel, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times is from Charles Dickens, right? And I always thought that this line was about how sometimes life is good and sometimes life is bad. And a couple of years ago, actually working on Even When I Fall, I really started to understand it differently and realized that life is good for some people and life is bad for other people. And, times might be changing, but the reality actually for probably the vast majority of filmmakers, and some of them who are absolutely deserving of much bigger platforms, is that these big fluctuations are right at the top, and it's only going to be a tiny percentage of those people that crack through and make it. I think the Netflix thing, to me, is a bit of that there are a lot of filmmakers who are holding out for this big thing because there are so many stories going around, and that's really destructive because it's promising this unpromisable thing, or there's this kind of hope through that. But so yeah, I don't really know what to say in a sense. I think.
But that's why I don't think we can predict.
Yeah, it's
and I
very
don't think we can kind of keep focusing on that, because we have to provide the solutions to or not the solutions, but the alternatives to that Netflix model.
So I think, if there are broadcasters getting together to support certain films, it would be great to see that support for stories that are really strong, but not necessarily known directors yet. You can trust in a team, or you can help build a team, or you can help give the space for something really special to develop. I think it's sharing that risk.
I think we do that.
And I think
we
this emphasis on craft, you have this emphasis on craft, and as a director, I think for me, the future is about craft, and it's about, the opportunities, some of the opportunities that have opened up, and the spaces that have opened up are at the premium end of the market. And it is very much about, as you've all said, an emphasis on storytelling, on craft, on editing, on really sort of loving the form and the process, and sort of bringing that to the filmmaking.
Actually, I think the premium end of the market, if that means the kind of most commercial big documentaries, I think they are easier to take a risk with because they're subjects that already have an audience. The audience is clearly defined, so it feels like we can take a risk more easily because we know that people will be interested in them. And so actually, I do think it's up to those documentaries to set the bar in terms of storytelling and tell better stories, actually, because sometimes those films don't really need to, and sometimes they don't. And actually, you've got smaller films that are made on nothing over a very long time that set the bar in terms of storytelling. Will never have that visibility, but actually, when we're talking about the stories and the telling, that's what we should be looking at.
Quite right, yeah.
But it's actually the films that they're in the focus that we're not questioning more enough. I mean, I'm not targeting any specific films, but I just think the thing that I see the most at the moment is films about recognizable people or characters, and I think I understand why that's happening, and in a sense that's great, but it's not actually creating a bigger audience for documentaries. It's those films are made for the people who are already interested in those subjects, and perhaps not very much more than that. And maybe if there was more impact, more focus on craft specifically, maybe that would broaden the documentary kind of lover landscape. But
This is what really struck me about your film, A Northern Soul, which everyone should see. And just talking about how these issues exist on both sides of the camera, for the directors, but also for the subjects, because you see this whole issue with 0-hour contracts, and here's a man working a job with unbelievable hours and has to travel an hour and a half there and back every 2 weeks to see his daughter, and to see how physically exhausted he is. And he's also doing stuff in the community for younger kids, trying to get them interested in music, and he's not supported by his company to do this, even though they're getting promoted as part of the activities, the cultural activities. But you just go, there is somebody that just needs a break, needs to go to sleep. People are really living on a knife's edge, and this is in our own country as well.
I'm going to stop you there. I hope that answered your question to some extent. Any other questions?
there's a question just there.
Questions? There's one gentleman here. By the way, when I was preparing for this panel, I came across an old tin of Sheffield Docfest sweets, and I'm going to give this to the best question asked. Unfortunately, they're out of date since about 2015. So if you have any bad meat market meetings, these are the sweets to give to the people. Sorry, after you.
I'm Mark Galloway from the International Broadcasting Trust. I wanted to go back to something you said at the beginning, Lisa Marie. You said you didn't want social impact documentaries, but of course you wanted your documentaries to have an impact. So I'm not quite sure what the difference is.
I know, I think this is going to haunt me, to be honest.
Can I just finish the question?
Yeah.
Particularly with reference to climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's great you're covering climate change because
Yeah.
it's so underreported.
Yeah.
But what is the impact that you hope to have with a climate change documentary?
So just to be 100% clear, the climate change, the interest in climate change, the company interest in that is like company-wide, and we know that there's a 2-year window before things become irreversible. So that's not specific to our fund. It's in relation to lots of activities that we're doing, but I'm just putting it out there because I've got a microphone and I can do that. But you could, yes, come to our fund with a creative documentary about climate change. If you came with a journalistic one, we would probably say go to the Birth of Journalism Fund. The term social impact, I use that in relation to journalism and how that is.
But I mean, don't we all want all of our films to have impact?
Yes, which is what I was saying about how we can take that skill set and bring it over. But I think I'm going to stop saying it because it confuses people. It really is straightforward, straight-up journalism that is not for the fund.
I mean, I know Mark's been involved in this area for many years, so perhaps this is the start of a conversation on sort of, perhaps this is the beginning of something, because you've been working on this for decades, haven't you? Any other questions? Another question. Lady over there. If you could just wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
I suspect I'm asking this question on behalf of a lot of people in this room who are too frightened to ask it themselves.
Great.
One of the good things about coming here is that you sit down and discover that the person sitting next to you is another lonely producer-director, desperately looking for a producer, an executive producer, somebody to share the burden, help them think it through, and help them get to funding. Now, obviously, there has to be something in it for the producer. One hopes that one's concept or one's film or one's material is adequate to that. But how do we find those producers?
Good question. There's a dearth of them. There's a dearth of Elhums. Elhum, how can we clone you?
I keep asking myself that, but I don't know. I think, well,
Can I answer that?
sure.
Because I think that's what these festivals are about, going and absorbing, looking at films, seeing the films you like, seeing who's on the credits, mixing, like even at the bar, mixing and meeting people and finding a common ground with someone that you want to work with who is interested in the same kinds of films you want to make, and has knowledge and contacts and so much of our industry is serendipitous like that, but so much of it is about relationships. Everything we do at Storyville is about our relationships with people. Storyville's had a really long-standing relationship with Sean and, supported A Northern Soul, and I'm so pleased it's kind of going on air. But he's the only working class, he's one of the only working class filmmakers in this country, and it's astounding that that we don't have more of those kinds of voices.
Mark Isaacs.
Yeah.
But I think you've touched on something very important. I think there is genuinely
But I think it is about being in these environments where you immerse yourself in the kinds of films that you're interested in, that you want to make, and connecting up with those people.
But do you feel like we don't have enough producers in this country?
No.
You think there are plenty?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I mean, and there's always more coming behind. There's more films than we can fund, and more films than we can possibly. I mean, it's always been thus.
Wow.
And feature docs are very they're a sexy thing. They're very popular. And
are there any particular talent streams that you think good producers are coming through?
There's a scheme called the Future Producers that's run here in Sheffield every year, and I was talking to Rachel Wexler, who set it up. It's a brilliant producer herself, and she was saying that probably 70 producers have been trained and supported and mentored through the Future Producers scheme in the last couple of years that they've run it. So that's the kind of pool of talents that. And I think just speaking to what Mandy was saying, it is about relationships, and it's about people, finding people who speak the same language as you, in the sense that they have the same drive you have to tell that story and to make that film. And that's actually the harder thing, I think, because when you're making a feature documentary that you're in it for a very long time, potentially. It doesn't end when the film's finished, but actually sometimes it takes years and years to actually make the film to begin with. So.
And that I think the thing is, it's the long-term nature of these relationships, isn't it? It's planting seeds and thinking forwards. I'm afraid if it's a quick question, we've got time for one last question just there, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. So pass it over there. Please keep it brief.
Okay. Just a very quick call out because of...
Sorry, no, it's only questions, no call-outs at this point.
Well,
Can we go
it's
to
about
the
the
lady
media scheme in
I'm
Europe.
sorry, no, we're taking any questions.
And that's where to meet
go to
producers.
the lady up there. We can all gather outside for a chat afterwards, and I encourage us all to do so. So please go to this lady because she's got a great shout-out for something.
Hardly need a microphone. Thank you, that's a great session. My question is about development, because as a director we want to come to you with great original ideas which nobody's done before, and they're more challenging. So for me, the most difficult stage is development, and you need, as well as all the love and commitment, you need some cash. So I'm just wondering, what's the best route with Storyville, for example? Are you doing any small development deals at the very beginning? It really helps us to have a toehold.
We're doing quite a few developments, but we obviously can only support so many developments, and every year the money's refreshed so we can do more. But of course we do development because there are some things we're really interested in that need further work or need to do the filmmaker to go and do a little bit of filming or some extra research to have a proof of concept.
Best way is just get in touch directly.
Yeah.
Great.
And we do it a lot. Yeah.
So I'm afraid that's it. I do encourage us all to have a coffee outside, continue chatting outside. I'd just like to thank all the staff and all my panellists, and particularly I'd like to thank all the volunteers because, they're working very hard, and thank you very much.